You mean to tell me that man is flying this plane? The voice cut through the cabin so sharply that conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Seatbelts hung forgotten in passengers' hands. Even the flight attendants paused for a moment. Richard Coleman stood in the aisle of Flight 728 from Atlanta to Denver, his face red with disbelief as he pointed toward the open cockpit door near the front of the aircraft. The boarding process had been moving smoothly until that moment. Now the entire cabin seemed frozen. A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others immediately looked toward the cockpit, trying to understand what had triggered the outburst. Richard shook his head. No, absolutely not. I am not flying with him. The words echoed across the rows of seats. A young flight attendant named Sarah stepped closer with a professional smile. Sir, is there a problem? Richard laughed bitterly. There is a huge problem. I just saw who is sitting in that cockpit. The cabin grew quieter. Some passengers looked down. Others stared openly. Near the front of the aircraft, Captain Elijah Brooks continued reviewing pre-flight information without reacting. 48 years old. 25 years in aviation. Thousands upon thousands of hours in the air. Yet from where Richard stood, none of that seemed to matter. All he saw was a black pilot. Sir, Sarah said carefully, Captain Brooks is fully qualified and, Richard interrupted her. I do not care what his qualifications are. I paid for this ticket. I want another flight. Several passengers visibly shifted in their seats. A woman across the aisle frowned. An older man near the window shook his head. The atmosphere inside the aircraft changed instantly. What had started as a routine boarding process now felt like a public confrontation. Captain Brooks remained calm. Through the open cockpit door, he continued his work exactly as before. No anger. No argument. No reaction. That somehow made the scene even more striking. Richard seemed almost frustrated by the lack of response. Are you hearing me? He called toward the front. I said I am not flying with him. The cockpit remained silent. Sarah maintained her professional composure, though the tension in her expression was becoming harder to hide. More passengers were watching now. Some whispered among themselves. Others simply stared at Richard in disbelief. The entire aircraft felt divided before it had even left the gate. Richard crossed his arms and stood his ground. He clearly expected people to agree with him. Instead, the silence around him felt increasingly uncomfortable. A little girl sitting several rows back looked up at her mother and asked softly, "Why is that man yelling?" Her mother did not answer. Nobody seemed quite sure what to say. Outside the aircraft windows, baggage crews continued loading luggage beneath the bright afternoon sun. Everything beyond the cabin looked normal. Inside, however, something had shifted. A challenge had been issued in front of nearly 200 witnesses. And before this flight reached the runway, everyone on board would learn something about Captain Elijah Brooks that would change the entire conversation. Captain Elijah Brooks heard every word. The raised voice. The accusations. The uncomfortable silence that followed. Yet inside the cockpit, his hands continued moving across the pre-flight checklist with the same precision he had practiced for decades. Outside the windshield, the afternoon sky stretched across the horizon. Fuel levels were confirmed. Weather conditions reviewed. Flight systems checked. The work demanded attention, and Elijah had learned long ago that distractions only carried power if he allowed them to. His first officer glanced toward the cabin and then back at him. You okay? Elijah offered a faint smile. I am here to fly an airplane. The answer said everything. 25 years earlier, Elijah had stood on a small regional airfield in Alabama watching aircraft cross a bright summer sky. Most people around him had never seen a black airline captain. Some openly told him his dream was unrealistic. Others suggested he choose a different career entirely. Elijah remembered every conversation. Not because he carried bitterness, because he carried perspective. Every achievement in his career had been earned one flight at a time, one examination at a time, one difficult year at a time. The opinions of strangers had never altered reality. Back in the cabin, Richard Coleman remained standing. The attention of nearly 200 passengers seemed to fuel his confidence. I am just saying what everyone else is thinking, he announced loudly. The statement immediately drew mixed reactions. Some passengers looked away. Others frowned. A middle-aged woman seated near the emergency exit folded her arms. "Do not speak for me," she said firmly. Richard looked surprised. "You are comfortable with this?" The woman glanced toward the cockpit. "I am comfortable with qualified professionals doing their jobs." Several nearby passengers nodded. Not everyone, but enough for Richard to realize the cabin was not automatically on his side. Sarah continued trying to de-escalate the situation. "Sir, we want everyone to have a comfortable experience today." "Then get me another pilot," Richard replied. The request hung in the air. Nearby passengers exchanged glances. Even those who had remained silent seemed increasingly uncomfortable. Elijah, meanwhile, completed another item on the checklist. His heartbeat never changed. His breathing never changed. The remarkable thing about true confidence was that it rarely announced itself. Simply existed. Through the partially open cockpit door, a few passengers could see him working calmly. No anger. No frustration. No visible reaction at all. That calmness began influencing the atmosphere more than Richard's complaints. A young boy sitting several rows from the front leaned toward his father. "He looks pretty calm for somebody getting yelled at." His father smiled slightly. "That tells you something." Outside, airport ground crews disconnected service equipment from the aircraft. Boarding was nearly complete. The cabin door would soon close. Yet the emotional divide inside the airplane continued growing. Some passengers viewed Richard as a man standing up for his concerns. Others viewed him as a man exposing his prejudice in public. What nobody realized yet was that Captain Elijah Brooks had a story few people on board could imagine. And before this aircraft left the gate, that story would begin changing the minds of everyone listening. The aircraft door remained open, but the mood inside the cabin felt increasingly closed. What had begun as one passenger's complaint was turning into something larger. People were no longer simply waiting for departure. They were choosing sides. Richard Coleman remained in the aisle, convinced that persistence would eventually force the airline to give him what he wanted. Every few minutes he repeated some version of the same argument. "I am a paying customer. I have a right to feel comfortable. This airline should listen to its passengers." The words sounded reasonable on the surface, but the reason behind them had already become impossible to ignore. Several rows away, a woman traveling for business closed her laptop and shook her head. "Comfort and prejudice are not the same thing," she said quietly. The passenger beside her nodded. Across the cabin, an older couple exchanged uncomfortable looks. A few travelers seemed sympathetic to Richard, though none appeared eager to support him publicly. Most simply wanted the flight to leave on time. Sarah and another flight attendant continued moving through the cabin, trying to keep the atmosphere calm. Their professionalism never wavered, but the tension was becoming harder to manage. Every conversation eventually returned to the same question. Why was this still happening? Richard interpreted the silence around him as encouragement. "Look around," he announced. "People are afraid to say what they really think." The statement immediately drew a response from a man seated near the emergency exit. "Or maybe they just disagree with you." Several passengers glanced toward the speaker. Richard frowned. "You trust him?" "I trust the airline that hired him," the man replied. The exchange only deepened the divide. Some passengers nodded. Others remained silent. The cabin had become a reflection of something much larger than a delayed departure. It was a collision between assumption and evidence, emotion and reality. Near the front of the aircraft, Captain Elijah Brooks completed another series of checks. Through the partially open cockpit door, passengers could occasionally see him speaking calmly with his first officer. There was something remarkable about the contrast. The loudest person on the airplane held no authority. The quietest person held all of it. A teenage passenger seated by the window watched the scene carefully. "Why is the captain not saying anything?" he asked his mother. She considered the question. "Because he does not have to." The answer lingered. Outside, airport personnel removed the final service equipment from the aircraft. Boarding was complete. Departure time approached. Yet the emotional pressure inside the cabin continued building. Richard seemed determined to force a confrontation. Elijah seemed determined not to give him one. The difference between those choices was beginning to shape how the rest of the passengers viewed both men. What nobody realized was that the airline was about to offer Richard a decision. A simple decision. One that would reveal whether he truly believed in his complaints or whether he simply wanted an audience. And once that moment arrived, the entire tone of the flight would change. The aircraft should have been pushing back from the gate by now, but the cabin remained suspended in a strange kind of standstill. Passengers checked their watches. Flight attendants exchanged professional smiles that barely concealed the growing pressure. Richard Coleman was still standing in the aisle, convinced that persistence would eventually force the airline to change course. What he did not realize was that the airline had already made its decision. A gate supervisor named Melissa Grant stepped onto the aircraft and walked calmly toward the center of the cabin. Her appearance immediately drew attention. Travelers stopped whispering. Even Richard straightened slightly. Finally, someone with authority had arrived. "Sir," Melissa said politely, "I understand you have concerns regarding this flight." Richard nodded quickly. "That is correct. I am requesting a different captain." The cabin grew quiet again. Melissa maintained a neutral expression. "Captain Elijah Brooks is fully certified, fully qualified, and approved to operate this aircraft." Richard folded his arms. "That is not good enough." Several passengers sighed. Others shook their heads. Melissa remained calm. "Sir, if you do not wish to travel on this flight, we can assist you in finding alternative arrangements." The words landed like a stone in still water. For the first time since the confrontation began, Richard appeared genuinely surprised. He had expected negotiation. He had expected compromise. Instead, he had been given a choice. Stay on the aircraft or leave it. Nothing in between. "You are saying the airline is choosing him over me?" Richard asked. Melissa answered carefully. "The airline is standing behind its crew and its safety standards." A few passengers exchanged approving glances. The businessman who had spent the last 30 minutes demanding special treatment suddenly found himself without the leverage he thought he possessed. Yet instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Unbelievable," he muttered loudly. "Nobody wants to say what everybody is thinking." A woman seated near the front finally spoke up. "No, sir. We just do not agree with you." Several heads nodded immediately. Richard looked around the cabin and discovered something uncomfortable. The audience he thought he had was disappearing. One by one, passengers were becoming less interested in his complaints and more interested in reaching Denver on time. Melissa glanced toward the cockpit and then back to Richard. "I need your decision, sir." The silence stretched. Outside the windows, the jet bridge remained attached. Ground crews waited. The entire aircraft seemed to be holding its breath. Richard looked toward the cockpit door. It remained partially open. Captain Elijah Brooks continued preparing the flight as though none of this were happening. That composure somehow made the situation even more frustrating for Richard. He wanted a confrontation. He wanted an argument. He wanted acknowledgement. Instead, he was receiving professionalism. Finally, Richard sat down heavily in his seat. "Fine," he said. "But I am filing a complaint." Melissa nodded politely. "That is your right, sir." She turned and walked back toward the front of the aircraft. As she disappeared through the cabin, a subtle shift moved through the passengers. The confrontation was not over, but the balance of power had changed. Richard believed he had won by remaining on the flight. In reality, he had just placed himself in the exact seat from which he would soon hear a message that would change the entire cabin. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet after Richard Coleman finally took his seat, but the tension remained suspended in the air like a storm that had not yet decided where to land. Passengers returned to their phones, their books, and their conversations, yet nobody seemed fully focused on any of them. Every few moments, someone glanced toward the front of the aircraft. They were waiting. Not necessarily for departure. For resolution. Richard sat rigidly by the aisle, convinced he had made a statement. The problem was that the statement was no longer having the effect he expected. Earlier he had commanded attention. Now he was attracting something far less comfortable. Disapproval. The businessman across the aisle who had initially appeared sympathetic now avoided eye contact. A woman near the window quietly shook her head each time Richard muttered under his breath, Even the passengers who remained neutral seemed exhausted by the situation. Richard noticed it. That only deepened his frustration. A few minutes later, the lead flight attendant approached one final time. Sarah maintained the same professional tone she had carried throughout the entire ordeal. "Sir, before we close the aircraft door, I need to confirm your decision." Richard looked up. "My decision?" "Yes, sir. You may continue traveling on this flight, or we can assist you with rebooking arrangements." The offer was calm, respectful, clear. Several nearby passengers listened carefully. Richard stared at her. "I already told you. I am staying." Sarah nodded. "Very well, sir." She began to walk away before Richard added, "But I still think this airline is making a mistake." Sarah paused briefly. "Our airline places passenger safety above everything else." Then she continued toward the front of the aircraft. The response irritated Richard because it gave him nothing to argue with. Safety, professional standards, qualifications. The airline continued returning to the same facts. Facts left very little room for assumptions. In the cockpit, Captain Elijah Brooks completed the final stages of flight preparation. The aircraft was nearly ready for departure. His first officer glanced toward the cabin once again. "Interesting day." Elijah smiled faintly. "Every flight teaches something." The first officer laughed softly. "You seem remarkably calm." Elijah looked out across the runway. People reveal themselves when they are given enough time. Back in the cabin, passengers settled deeper into their seats, as the jet bridge remained attached for a few final moments. Outside the windows, airport workers moved efficiently beneath the late afternoon sun. Everything about the scene suggested that departure was close. Richard crossed his arms and stared toward the cockpit door. Part of him seemed to expect Captain Brooks to emerge and defend himself, to argue, to challenge him. Yet none of that happened. The silence coming from the front of the aircraft was becoming more powerful than any speech. Then a soft chime echoed through the cabin speakers. Conversation stopped instantly. Seatbelts clicked into place. Heads turned toward the ceiling. The aircraft door had just closed. The moment everyone had been waiting for had arrived. Richard leaned back with a look of stubborn certainty. He still believed he was right. He still believed the airline had ignored him. What he did not know was that within the next few minutes, a voice would come across the intercom and transform the entire atmosphere inside the airplane. The soft chime faded, and for a brief moment the cabin became perfectly still. The aircraft door was closed. The decision had been made. Everyone on board was now traveling together. A second later, the familiar sound of the public address system clicked through the speakers overhead. Instantly, conversations stopped. Passengers looked up from their phones. Flight attendants paused their final checks. Even Richard Coleman shifted slightly in his seat. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The voice that followed was calm, steady, and unmistakably professional. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Elijah Brooks speaking. On behalf of our entire crew, welcome aboard Flight 728 with service to Denver." The cabin listened. Elijah's tone carried the kind of confidence that could not be manufactured. It was the voice of someone completely comfortable with responsibility. "Weather conditions along our route are favorable today, and we expect a smooth flight time of approximately 2 hours and 45 minutes. Several passengers relaxed immediately. There was something reassuring about the way he spoke. No emotion, no defensiveness, no sign that anything unusual had happened during boarding. Richard frowned slightly. He had expected some acknowledgement of the confrontation. Instead, the captain continued as though the most important thing on the aircraft was the safe transport of every passenger. "Before we begin our departure procedures, I would like to take a moment to thank each of you for choosing to fly with us today." The cabin remained quiet. The wording felt slightly different from a standard announcement. More personal, more deliberate. Sarah noticed it too. So did several passengers near the front. Elijah continued, "For 25 years, I have had the privilege of serving passengers across the United States and around the world. During that time, I have learned that trust is one of the most important responsibilities a pilot can earn." A few travelers exchanged curious glances. Richard straightened in his seat. For the first time all afternoon, the attention of the entire aircraft was focused on one person. And that person was not him. Every member of this flight crew understands that responsibility. We train continuously. We are evaluated continuously. We are held to the highest professional standards every single day. The words landed differently now. Not because they were dramatic, because they were true. The authority behind them came from experience rather than pride. Near the rear of the cabin, a businessman quietly nodded. A woman who had challenged Richard earlier smiled faintly. The mood of the aircraft was beginning to shift. Elijah paused briefly before continuing. Many people see a pilot's uniform and assume they understand the journey behind it. The truth is that every captain sitting in a cockpit represents years of training, sacrifice, discipline, and commitment. The silence grew deeper. Richard stared straight ahead. Something about the announcement was making him increasingly uncomfortable, though he could not yet explain why. Outside the windows, the pushback vehicle moved into position. The aircraft was preparing to leave the gate. Inside the cabin, however, something even more significant was beginning to move. A story. A truth. And before Captain Elijah Brooks finished speaking, every passenger on board would understand exactly who was guiding them into the sky. The cabin remained silent as Captain Elijah Brooks continued speaking through the intercom. By now, every passenger was listening. Even those who had been absorbed in phones and laptops earlier sat still, focused on the calm voice coming from the flight deck. Throughout my career, Elijah said, I have been fortunate to fly millions of miles and serve passengers from every walk of life. Aviation has taught me many lessons, but one remains constant. Excellence is not determined by appearance. It is determined by preparation, discipline, and responsibility. The words settled gently across the aircraft. There was no anger behind them, no accusation. That made them even more powerful. Richard Coleman stared ahead without moving. Around him, passengers exchanged thoughtful glances. Elijah continued, This year marks my 25th year as an airline captain. During that time, I have logged more than 18,000 flight hours. I have trained new pilots, evaluated captains, and participated in safety programs used throughout our industry. A ripple of surprise moved through the cabin. Several passengers looked toward the cockpit door. 18,000 hours. The number carried weight. It represented decades of experience, decades of responsibility, decades of earning trust one flight at a time. Elijah's voice remained steady. Last year, I was honored to receive our airline's highest safety recognition, after completing 20 years without a preventable incident. That achievement belongs not only to me, but to every crew member who has worked beside me. The reaction was immediate. A woman near the front raised her eyebrows. A businessman seated across the aisle quietly shook his head in disbelief. Two passengers began whispering to each other. The atmosphere inside the aircraft was changing with every sentence. What had once been an argument about assumptions was becoming a lesson about reality. Sarah stood near the galley listening carefully. Even she had not known every detail of the captain's background. Pride spread across her face. Nearby passengers noticed. They could see the respect the crew had for him. Respect earned long before anyone boarded this flight. Elijah paused briefly before speaking again. Every pilot who sits in a cockpit carries an enormous responsibility. The lives of hundreds of people depend on our decisions. That responsibility is never taken lightly. Richard swallowed hard. For the first time all afternoon, he seemed unsure of himself. The confidence that had fueled his complaints was fading. Around him, passengers were no longer looking toward him for answers. They were listening to the captain. One teenager seated near the window leaned toward his father and whispered, "That is a lot of experience." His father nodded. More than most people will ever achieve in a lifetime. Outside, the aircraft slowly began pushing back from the gate. Inside, something far more significant had already shifted. The entire cabin now understood what Richard had failed to understand from the beginning. The man in the cockpit was not simply qualified. He was one of the most accomplished professionals many of them would ever meet. And for Richard, that realization was becoming impossible to escape. As the aircraft continued its slow movement away from the gate, an unusual silence settled across the cabin. It was not the silence of boredom or routine travel. It was the silence that follows a truth nobody can ignore. Richard Coleman sat motionless in his seat, staring toward the front of the aircraft. Earlier, he had spoken loudly enough for nearly every passenger to hear. Now he seemed determined not to speak at all. Around him, the reactions were subtle but impossible to miss. The woman who had challenged him earlier returned to her book, though not before giving a small shake of her head. The businessman across the aisle focused on his phone, but occasionally glanced toward Richard with visible disappointment. Nobody was arguing anymore. Nobody needed to. Captain Elijah Brooks had never defended himself. His accomplishments had done that for him. The public address system clicked once more. Immediately, passengers looked up again. Elijah's voice returned, calm and composed. "Thank you for your attention, ladies and gentlemen. I know many of you are eager to begin your journey, and so are we." A few smiles appeared throughout the cabin. The tension that had dominated the boarding process was beginning to dissolve. "I would also like to recognize the incredible professionals who make every flight possible. From our flight attendants to our maintenance teams, dispatchers, and ground crews, aviation has always been a team effort." The statement reflected exactly what many passengers had come to expect from him. Even after revealing an extraordinary career, he continued directing attention toward others. That humility made an impression. Sarah stood near the forward galley and smiled quietly. Several passengers noticed. Respect for the captain was no longer confined to the cockpit. It had spread throughout the aircraft. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For the first time all afternoon, he appeared aware of how isolated he had become. Nobody confronted him. Nobody mocked him. Yet somehow that felt more powerful. The absence of support spoke louder than criticism ever could. A teenager several rows behind him whispered to his father. He never even argued back. His father nodded. The strongest people usually do not have to. The words were soft, but Richard heard them. Outside the windows, the runway stretched beneath the fading afternoon light. Inside, passengers began preparing for departure. Seatbacks were upright. Carry-on bags secured. The flight attendants completed their final checks. Normalcy was returning. Yet the atmosphere felt different from when the flight began. Lighter. Wiser. More reflective. Elijah's voice came through the speakers one final time before departure. "Wherever you come from, whatever your background may be, every passenger on this aircraft deserves the same commitment to safety, professionalism, and respect. That commitment is something our crew is proud to provide every day." No applause followed. None was necessary. The silence itself carried meaning. It was the silence of people recognizing character when they saw it. As the aircraft turned toward the runway, nearly every passenger understood that the real lesson of the day had never been about flying. It had been about assumptions. And one man in particular was learning that lesson more clearly than anyone else on board. The aircraft accelerated smoothly down the runway as the last light of afternoon stretched across the horizon beyond the cabin windows. Within seconds, the city below began to shrink, roads becoming thin lines and buildings fading into patterns of light and shadow. For most passengers, the flight had finally become what they expected when they boarded. Quiet, predictable, routine. Yet the events that had unfolded before departure lingered in the minds of nearly everyone on board. Richard Coleman sat motionless in his seat, staring out the window without really seeing the landscape below. Hours earlier, he had been certain of himself, certain of his judgment, certain that he understood the person sitting in the cockpit. Now he found himself replaying every moment in his head. The raised voice, the public complaints, the confidence that had vanished the instant facts entered the conversation. Across the cabin, passengers settled into their journeys. Some read books. Some watched movies. Others simply rested. The tension was gone. In its place remained a quiet understanding. Captain Elijah Brooks had never argued, never defended himself, never demanded respect. He had simply done what professionals do. He had shown up prepared, remained calm under pressure, and allowed his character to speak louder than anyone else's opinion. Nearly 2 hours later, the aircraft began its descent into Denver. The flight had been remarkably smooth. Every announcement had been clear. Every phase of the journey had reflected the same professionalism Elijah displayed from the beginning. As the city lights appeared below, Passengers prepared for arrival. Seatbacks were turned upright. Window shades opened. Conversations resumed. Then the familiar chime sounded once more. Elijah's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be on the ground shortly. On behalf of our entire crew, thank you for flying with us today. We know you have many choices when you travel, and we appreciate the trust you place in us." The words were simple, yet after everything that had happened they carried greater meaning. "Wherever life takes you next, we wish you a safe journey." The announcement ended. Minutes later, the aircraft touched down smoothly. As passengers gathered their belongings after arriving at the gate, something unusual happened. Several travelers paused near the cockpit while leaving. Some thanked the crew. Others offered a smile or a nod toward the front. Sarah noticed it immediately. Respect was being expressed without fanfare, without speeches, without being requested. Richard remained seated longer than most passengers. When he finally stood, the cabin was nearly empty. He glanced toward the cockpit door, then lowered his eyes. For a moment, it looked as though he wanted to say something. An apology, an explanation, perhaps both. Instead, he quietly collected his bag and walked off the aircraft. Elijah never saw him leave. He was already focused on the responsibilities ahead. Another flight, another crew, another group of passengers placing their trust in him. And that was the lesson none of the passengers would forget. The strongest people do not spend their lives proving who they are. They spend their lives becoming who they are. The problem was never whether Captain Elijah Brooks deserved to fly that airplane. The problem was how quickly someone had judged a man they never truly knew. And by the end of the journey, that truth had become impossible to ignore.